Black twin girls knock on elderly woman's door. Their confession turns her world upside down. Welcome, listeners. Today, we have a moving story about the strength of compassion and the unexpected bonds that change lives. In a quiet, lonely neighborhood, one woman's gentle heart and a chance connection with a struggling family next door reveal the power of kindness to transform even the darkest times. Helen Anderson's hands trembled slightly as she tended to the roses in her garden, their gentle fragrance filling the morning air. She was used to the silence on her quiet street, a kind of stillness that had settled over her neighborhood through the years as children grew. Families moved away, and houses turned over to new, unknown faces. As an 80-year-old widow, Helen found herself one of the last original neighbors on this street. The laughter and liveliness she remembered from years ago were now just fading echoes in her memory. Yet, despite the quiet, she found a kind of peace and purpose in her garden, which she'd maintained with care since her late husband, George, had passed. This morning, however, something unusual broke Helen's calm. She noticed movement out of the corner of her eye, and, glancing up, saw a large moving truck pull to a stop in front of the vacant house next door. The sight of it, unexpected yet thrilling, made her pause. There hadn't been a new family in months. The house, which had been on the market, remained empty despite the realtor's promises of showing after showing. Helen felt a glimmer of excitement in her chest. She straightened up, letting her gardening tools rest on the dewy grass, and watched as the truck doors opened. A woman in her early 30s stepped out first, wearing a bright yellow sundress that seemed to capture the light around her. Helen felt an immediate warmth toward her. There was something hopeful about her, something quietly courageous as she stood on the pavement, taking in her surroundings. Behind her, two young girls, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, hopped down from the truck, their matching outfits and eager expressions leaving no doubt that they were twins. The girls' eyes were wide with curiosity as they took in the new neighborhood, their gaze finally settling on Helen. Helen felt her heart soften at the sight of them. It had been so long since the sound of young voices filled the air on this street, and she already imagined how their laughter and games might breathe new life into the place. Helen thought back to her own childhood, a time when every street had children playing freely, parents calling out in the evening light, families gathering on their porches. She had often imagined the joy of raising children in a lively neighborhood with her husband George, a vision they had both cherished but never realized. Life had its own plans, yet standing there, she felt a spark of something almost like youth, a renewal of some hidden hope. The father stepped out last, a tall man with a serious expression. He looked around critically, surveying the neighborhood as if sizing it up, his stance protective. Helen couldn't read him, but something about his guardedness made her uneasy. She knew too well how love and protectiveness could sometimes turn into something else, something darker. Still, she brushed the feeling aside, hopeful that the family would bring companionship, or at least a friendly presence. She offered a wave, a small gesture of welcome. To her delight, the mother waved back, her face breaking into a warm smile. But her wave was interrupted. The man turned, speaking sharply to his wife as she began to step toward Helen. His tone curt. The mother looked down, her smile fading, and Helen felt her chest tighten with a pang of sadness. She'd seen that look before, a look of hesitation mixed with disappointment, as if a joy had been stifled before it could grow. The woman gave Helen a brief, apologetic glance, and then turned to help the girls with a suitcase. Helen lingered for a moment, uncertain, before deciding to give them some privacy. They would need time to settle in, she reasoned, and there would be chances to introduce herself properly in the days to come. As Helen returned to her roses, her thoughts wandered. She remembered George and the many dreams they'd shared when they were young, filling up their modest home with visions of a future brimming with love and laughter. She often thought of the plans they had made together, the children they'd hoped for but couldn't have, the holidays they'd imagined with family. The sense of community they'd both cherished now seemed like something out of a fading memory, and she longed for the chance to see it brought back, even in some small way, as she snipped away dead blossoms. Helen's gaze drifted back toward the house next door. She couldn't help but wonder about the young mother, about what had brought this family to her quiet street. There was something almost fragile about the way the woman had looked at her, something that made Helen's heart ache. Perhaps it was a softness that had seen its share of bruises, or a kindness dimmed by hardship. Whatever it was, Helen recognized it and felt a sudden urge to help in some way, to reach out and offer this woman and her daughters a safe place in her heart. The sun was beginning to set as Helen wrapped up her gardening for the day, gathering her tools and casting one last glance toward the house. The lights inside were off, and the curtains drawn, giving the place a sense of quiet isolation. She was about to dismiss her concerns, reasoning that they were simply tired from the move, when a thought crossed her mind. She had been meaning to bake a lemon drizzle cake, one of George's favorites. Perhaps she could bring it over tomorrow as a welcome gift. The thought of extending a hand of friendship, a gesture to show that she was there if they needed her, gave her a renewed sense of purpose. As Helen made her way inside, a familiar warmth filled her living room. The soft glow of the fireplace mingled with the low hum of the television, creating a cozy atmosphere that was both a comfort and a reminder of all she'd lost. Settling into her armchair, she allowed herself a brief moment to imagine what it would be like to have visitors again, to share laughter and stories, to hear the patter of little feet on her porch. Yet, as she drifted towards sleep, a faint unease tugged at her. She couldn't quite explain it, but there was something in the way the father had looked at the mother, something she couldn't shake. It wasn't anything obvious, just a small, unspoken tension that made her worry. She told herself it was simply her imagination, a side effect of her solitude, but the feeling lingered. As Helen closed her eyes, the sound of children's laughter echoed faintly in her mind, mingling with memories of George and the warmth of the life they'd once envisioned together. She couldn't help but wonder, perhaps with a touch of wistfulness, if this new family might be a gift of sorts, a way for her to relive those dreams she had held so close to her heart. Little did she know, her life was on the verge of an unexpected journey, one that would test her strength, compassion, and the very dreams she'd thought had faded long ago. The following morning dawned bright and clear, bathing the quiet street in a gentle, golden light. Helen woke with a sense of purpose, an eagerness she hadn't felt in some time. She spent the morning carefully baking her lemon drizzle cake, humming softly as she went through the familiar motions. Her kitchen, usually filled only with her quiet presence, felt somehow lighter, the aroma of lemon and sugar lifting her spirits. She took special care in the presentation, allowing the glaze to settle just so, and choosing her best plate to place it on. This cake wasn't just a neighborly gesture. It was her way of opening a door, an invitation for friendship, or at the very least, a shared moment. Once the cake was ready, Helen slipped on a pretty cardigan and took a deep breath, as though steeling herself for the small journey next door. Walking across her porch and up the garden path, she noticed again how still everything felt on her street. The curtains in her new neighbor's windows were still drawn, and no sounds emerged from within the house. A slight flicker of unease touched her mind, but she quickly dismissed it. It was perfectly normal, she reasoned. They had probably spent a long night unpacking and were still sleeping in. She raised her hand and rang the doorbell, feeling her heart quicken in anticipation. After a few moments, the door creaked open, and Helen found herself face to face with the young mother from the day before. Up close, she could see the woman's dark eyes, which held a warmth and softness that immediately put Helen at ease. Yet, Helen also noted the shadows beneath her eyes and a subtle tension in her expression, as though she were carrying a weight she couldn't quite shake. "Oh, good morning," the woman said, her voice gentle but tinged with surprise. "Good morning," Helen replied, smiling brightly. "I'm Helen, from next door. I thought I'd welcome you with a little something sweet." She held out the plate, and a faint blush of gratitude appeared on the woman's face as she accepted it. "Thank you. That's so thoughtful. I'm Lisa. It's lovely to meet you properly." But before either of them could say more, The man from the day before stepped into view, his face hardening as he took in the scene. "Who is it?" he asked, his voice cool and slightly impatient. Lisa's shoulders seemed to tense, but she kept her smile as she introduced Helen. "This is Helen, from next door. She was kind enough to bring us a cake." The man, whom Helen now knew as Jake, offered a brief nod but kept his gaze guarded. "Thanks," he said curtly. "We just got a lot to do today, settling in and all." He made no move to invite Helen in or continue the conversation, and his tone was clear enough. The visit was over. Helen's heart sank a little, but she maintained her warm demeanor, refusing to let Jake's coolness overshadow her gesture. "Of course," she replied. "I just wanted to say hello. Moving is always such a big job. Let me know if you need anything at all." Lisa offered Helen a small, grateful smile, her eyes flickering with something Helen couldn't quite read. "Thank you. Really. It's nice to know we have a friendly face nearby." With that, the door gently closed, and Helen found herself back on the porch, feeling a mix of emotions. She was slightly taken aback by Jake's standoffishness, yet she couldn't help but feel there was more to it. Lisa's grateful, but somewhat apologetic look lingered in her mind, as did the unspoken tension in her posture. Helen knew that look, a kind of cautious gratitude, tempered by something hidden beneath the surface. Returning home, she busied herself with small tasks, her thoughts continually drifting back to her neighbors. As the day stretched on, she decided to shake off her unease. It was probably just moving stress. She told herself, new environments could be unsettling, and perhaps Jake was simply overprotective. Helen resolved to give them some space, hoping they would reach out when ready. It wasn't until dusk settled over the neighborhood that the stillness was broken. Helen had just settled into her armchair, cradling a cup of tea as she watched the evening shadows stretch across her lawn, when a sudden, faint noise drew her attention. A muffled bang, followed by silence. She listened, straining to catch any further sound. But the neighborhood remained quiet. A sense of unease prickled in the back of her mind, but she dismissed it as nothing more than a harmless thud, a box falling over, or maybe a piece of furniture being moved. But just as she began to relax, a soft knock came at her door. Helen's heart skipped as she set down her tea and rose from her chair, wondering who could be visiting at this hour. When she opened the door, she was surprised to find the twins standing on her porch, their small faces tight with worry, hands clasped tightly together. "Hello, dears," Helen said gently, crouching down to meet them at eye level. "Is everything all right?" The girls exchanged a glance, their eyes wide with fear and something else, an unspoken plea, one that went far beyond their years. One of them, her voice barely more than a whisper, finally spoke. "Our dad doesn't like us." The words were so quiet, so fragile, that Helen's breath caught. She felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of shock, sadness, and an overwhelming protectiveness. She reached out, resting a comforting hand on the girl's shoulder. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Before the girl could answer, the silence was shattered by a sharp, angry voice calling from down the street. "Girls, what do you think you're doing out here?" Helen looked up to see Jake striding toward them, his face hard and his steps quick. The twins flinched, shrinking back toward Helen, their small hands clutching each other tightly. In that moment, Helen saw the fear in their eyes, a fear no child should ever carry. The girls looked up at her, their expressions a heartbreaking mix of hope and apology. "We have to go," one of them whispered hurriedly. Without another word, they turned and scurried back down the steps, their small shoulders hunched as though trying to make themselves invisible. Jake caught up to them halfway, his hand gripping each of their arms as he steered them firmly back toward the house. Helen stood frozen on her porch, her heart pounding as she watched them disappear through the door, which slammed shut with a final, resounding thud. She felt a sense of helplessness, mingled with a growing anís y suspicion, as Helen turned back to her house. The girl's words echoed in her mind. "Our dad doesn't like us." She felt a heaviness settle in her chest, one that refused to fade even as she tried to shake it off. Helen couldn't sleep that night. The words of the twins haunted her, replaying in her mind as she lay in bed, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. She tried to tell herself that she had misunderstood, that perhaps the girls were simply adjusting to a new place and new rules. But the fear in their eyes was something she couldn't ignore. A deep, primal dread that tugged at her heart. Morning finally broke through her sleepless night, casting a pale light over her quiet street. Helen rose with a sense of purpose. She would find a way to reach out again, to understand what had frightened the girls so. She moved to the kitchen, preparing her morning tea as she considered what she might do next. A small voice within her told her to stay out of it, that it was none of her business. But her heart wouldn't allow it. Something inside her urged her to act, and she knew she couldn't simply ignore that call. Throughout the morning, Helen's thoughts circled back to her new neighbors, and the uneasy feeling she had felt ever since their arrival. Just as she decided to walk over and check in, there was a firm knock at her door. Her heart leapt in surprise, a mix of hope and anxiety as she opened it, only to find two police officers standing on her porch. "Good morning, ma'am," the older officer said with a respectful nod. "Are you Mrs. Helen Anderson?" "Yes," Helen replied, her voice catching slightly. "I'm Officer Mackenzie, and this is Officer Brown. We're here to ask you a few questions about your neighbors. We received a call regarding a possible concern for the welfare of the children in that household." A wave of relief and worry swept over Helen at the same time. She hadn't called the police herself, but she was grateful that someone else had been watching, someone who had shared her concerns. "Yes, officers," she said, gesturing for them to come inside. "Please, come in." The officers stepped in, their eyes scanning the tidy, cozy surroundings of her home as she led them to the living room. Helen motioned for them to sit, but they remained standing, looking at her expectantly. "Mrs. Anderson, we understand that you may have had some interactions with the family," Officer Mackenzie said, pulling out a small notebook. "Would you be able to tell us anything about them, particularly the children?" Helen took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "Yes, I met them a couple of days ago. The mother, Lisa, she seems kind. We had a pleasant exchange when I brought over a welcome cake. But her husband, he seemed very guarded, cold, even. And then yesterday," her voice trailed off as she recalled the scene from the night before. "Yes, go on," Officer Brown prompted gently. "The twins came to my door," Helen continued, her voice soft but firm. "They seemed frightened, and one of them said something that's been troubling me all night. She told me, well, she said their father doesn't like them." Helen looked up, her eyes searching the officers' faces for understanding. And the way they said it, it wasn't just a child's complaint. They were scared, terrified, actually. And when he saw them, he grabbed them so roughly. I've never seen children react like that. The officers exchanged a glance, their expressions growing more serious. Officer Mackenzie made a few notes, then looked back up at her. "Thank you, Mrs. Anderson. That's very helpful. It aligns with some of what we've heard already." Helen's curiosity and concern grew. "Have others noticed anything?" "We can't disclose details, ma'am," Officer Brown replied with a gentle tone. "But we're conducting a welfare check on the family. We take these matters very seriously, especially when children are involved." As the officers prepared to leave, Officer Mackenzie turned to Helen with a reassuring look. "Thank you for being vigilant, Mrs. Anderson. If anything else comes to your attention, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. You're doing the right thing by looking out for them." After they left, Helen sat down, her heart still racing. She had done all she could for now, but the encounter had only sharpened her resolve to keep an eye on the family. That afternoon, Helen noticed the police car parked discreetly a little ways down the street, likely in case they needed to respond quickly. The sight gave her some reassurance, but also filled her with sadness. She wished she could simply knock on Lisa's door and be there for her, to offer a safe space, a listening ear, something, anything that could ease whatever burden she was carrying. Later that evening, Helen was sitting by her window, gazing out into the soft glow of street lamps illuminating the quiet neighborhood. She was just beginning to relax when she heard the faint sound of raised voices coming from next door. Her heart tightened as she recognized Jake's sharp, angry tone. though she couldn't make out the words. She strained her ears, hoping to catch any hint of Lisa's voice or the twins. But there was only Jake, his voice echoing through the thin walls. Filled with anger, Helen debated calling the police again. But before she could make up her mind, the yelling ceased, replaced by an eerie silence that settled over the street like a heavy fog. She wanted to believe it was over, that perhaps things would quiet down and no further trouble would come. But as she sat there, her fingers trembling slightly, she knew that this silence felt different. It was the kind that held secrets, the kind that left questions lingering in the air. The next morning, she decided to act. She would find a way to check on Lisa and the girls, regardless of Jake's intimidating presence. As she stepped onto her porch, Helen noticed movement next door. Lisa was standing on her own front porch, staring off into the distance. Helen's heart clenched at the sight of her, standing there so alone, so seemingly isolated. Her eyes held a sorrow that Helen recognized. And in that brief moment, their gazes met. She offered Lisa a gentle wave, hoping it would be enough of an invitation for her to approach. To her relief, Lisa returned the wave with a hesitant smile and, after a moment's pause, began walking over. "Good morning, Helen," she said softly when she reached the edge of Helen's porch, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Good morning, dear," Helen replied, keeping her tone warm and welcoming. "I was just about to make some tea. Would you like to join me?" Lisa hesitated, glancing back at her house with a look of worry, but then nodded, offering a small, grateful smile. "Yes, thank you. That sounds nice." Helen led her inside, sensing the fragility of the moment. They settled in the living room, and as Helen poured the tea, she waited patiently, not wanting to push Lisa into speaking before she was ready. After a few moments of quiet, Lisa's gaze drifted toward the window, and her expression softened with a mixture of sadness and relief. "I don't know how to thank you," Lisa murmured, her hands trembling slightly as she took the cup Helen offered. "You've been so kind, and I don't know if I deserve it." Helen reached out, placing a gentle hand over Lisa's. "Everyone deserves kindness, my dear," she said softly. "I'm here, whenever you need me." As they sat there in the gentle glow of Helen's warm living room, she sensed that Lisa wanted to share more, to unburden herself. Helen waited patiently, knowing that sometimes the best thing one could offer was simply the quiet promise of being there. And so, with hearts quietly aligned in mutual understanding, they sipped their tea, neither of them yet aware of the difficult journey that lay ahead. The days that followed were marked by small moments between Helen and Lisa, each exchange gradually building a bond that had been unspoken but needed. Helen took careful note of the way Lisa would look at her, a mixture of longing and fear in her eyes, as though she wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. The twins, Emily and Sophie, appeared less frequently on Helen's porch after that night, but whenever they did, they always carried the same guarded look, and Helen's heart ached to know what they might be hiding. One evening, Helen noticed the girls playing in the yard under Lisa's watchful eye. She saw Emily look toward her house with a brief flicker of recognition, as if remembering the warmth of her porch. Helen gave her a small wave, and Emily's face lit up with a shy smile. Sophie's hand still clutched tightly in hers. Helen could see that, even in play, the twins were cautious, staying close to Lisa as though they were bound by an invisible line of safety. That evening, as the sun dipped low, casting a soft amber glow across the street, Helen decided to make her move. She baked a batch of shortbread cookies, simple and sweet, and once they cooled, she wrapped them in a cloth and walked over to Lisa's house. As she neared the front steps, she hesitated, noticing how quiet it was inside. She took a deep breath, steadied her resolve, and knocked gently. A moment later, the door opened, and Lisa stood there, her face touched with surprise and perhaps a hint of relief. She looked at the cloth-wrapped cookies and then at Helen, her lips parting in a soft, grateful smile. "I thought you and the girls might like a little treat," Helen said warmly, holding out the bundle. "Oh, thank you, Helen," Lisa replied, her voice wavering slightly. She reached out, taking the cookies, and Helen could see her hands tremble ever so slightly. Helen took a breath, sensing the moment to reach out had finally arrived. "How are you, Lisa?" Truly. For a long second, Lisa looked away, her gaze drifting toward the narrow hallway behind her. When she turned back to Helen, her expression was one of quiet desperation, as if holding onto a secret that was slowly unraveling. But before she could answer, a sound came from somewhere deeper in the house, a sharp, muffled voice calling her name. Lisa flinched, her fingers tightening around the bundle of cookies. I should go," she whispered, her eyes clouding with worry. "Thank you again, Helen. Really?" She turned back, casting Helen an apologetic glance before closing the door gently, leaving Helen standing alone on the porch. The quiet tension of the house lingered in her mind long after she had walked back to her own home, and she knew with increasing certainty that there was a darkness there, something that Lisa felt powerless to escape. Helen felt the weight of helplessness pressing down on her, a feeling of frustration that simmered as she wondered what more she could do. That night, as she was settling into bed, Helen was startled by a quiet knock on her door. She rose quickly, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and worry. When she opened the door, she found Emily and Sophie standing there, their faces pale in the dim light, their expressions anxious. "Girls," Helen said softly, crouching down to their level. "What are you doing out here?" Sophie looked down, fidgeting with her fingers, but Emily met Helen's gaze with a fierce, pleading intensity. "Please, can we stay here for a little while?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Helen's heart broke at the sight of them, so small and vulnerable, standing there in the cold night air. Without hesitation, she reached out, gently pulling them into her warm embrace. "Of course you can, my dears," she said softly, leading them inside. She guided them to the living room, where the soft glow of a small lamp cast a comforting light over the cozy space. Helen sat them on the couch and wrapped a blanket around their shoulders, offering them a sense of safety and security that she sensed they'd been missing. "Would you like some warm milk?" she asked, trying to keep her voice soothing and gentle. Emily and Sophie both nodded, their eyes wide and watchful, like small animals seeking refuge. Helen moved quietly to the kitchen, preparing 2 cups of milk and adding a pinch of cinnamon, hoping to bring them a small measure of comfort. When she returned, she found them huddled close, whispering softly to each other. As they sipped their milk, Helen sat beside them, feeling the weight of their silence pressing on her. She wanted to ask them about what was troubling them, about what had brought them to her door in the night, but she knew that they needed time, that pushing them might only deepen the fear she saw in their eyes. After a few moments, Emily spoke, her voice so soft Helen had to lean in to hear her. "He doesn't like it when we play too loud." Sophie nodded solemnly, her eyes flickering toward the front door as though she expected it to open at any moment. Helen felt her chest tighten, but she kept her voice gentle. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. You deserve to feel safe and happy." Emily looked up at her, her eyes wide with a mixture of sadness and longing. "He gets mad a lot. He makes mommy cry sometimes." Sophie wrapped her arms around herself, as if trying to ward off the memory, and Helen felt a surge of protectiveness rise within her. She wished she could shield them from whatever pain and fear haunted their small lives. But all she could do in that moment was listen, offering them the warmth of her presence and her love. "I'm here for you," Helen whispered, placing a comforting hand on Emily's shoulder. "Anytime you need me, you can come to me. I'll keep you safe." A quiet silence settled over the room as the girls finished their milk, their small frames relaxing ever so slightly under the weight of Helen's assurance. She could see that they were beginning to trust her, that perhaps her home had become a sanctuary for them, even if only for brief moments of reprieve. After a while, Helen noticed that their eyes were drooping, exhaustion finally taking hold. She gently guided them to lie down on the couch, tucking the blanket around them as they drifted into sleep. She watched over them, feeling a deep, unspoken promise form within her, a vow to protect them, to be the safe place they could turn to in their darkest moments. As she sat beside them, her thoughts returned to Lisa. She wondered if Lisa knew her daughters were here, if she was even aware of the weight they carried. Helen hoped with all her heart that she would find a way to reach her, to break through whatever silence kept her bound. The room was quiet, the only sound the soft breaths of the girls as they slept. And as Helen looked at their peaceful faces, she felt a renewed determination settle within her. She didn't yet know how, but she was certain that she would do whatever it took to bring light to the shadows cast over this small family. In the stillness of the night, she whispered a quiet promise to herself. You are not alone. Not anymore. When Helen woke the next morning, Emily and Sophie were still curled up on her couch, the blanket drawn close around them. She watched them for a moment, noting the way they seemed peaceful, free from the worry that had marked their young faces the night before. Her heart felt heavy and full at once. She knew she had to be careful in how she approached their situation. Yet, she also knew she couldn't ignore it. Not now. As sunlight began to filter through her living room window, Helen rose and went to the kitchen to make breakfast. She hoped the warmth and comfort of a simple meal might help them feel safe enough to open up. Soon, the scent of scrambled eggs and toast filled the room, and the soft clinking of dishes stirred the girls awake. They rubbed their eyes, blinking in the morning light, and Helen greeted them with a gentle smile. Good morning, dears. I made breakfast if you're hungry. The twins exchanged a glance before nodding, their shy smiles warming Helen's heart. They joined her at the small kitchen table, their eyes lighting up at the spread of food. As they ate, the silence between them was comfortable, almost soothing, and Helen sensed they felt secure in her presence. She waited until they had nearly finished before she spoke. Emily, Sophie, Helen began softly. You know you can come here anytime, don't you? My door is always open to you. The girls looked up, their expressions growing serious. Emily's small hand reached for Sophie's, squeezing it tightly. After a pause, she whispered, Thank you, Miss Helen. Helen's heart broke at the weight of their gratitude, but she kept her voice steady. Would you like to tell me anything? About what's been bothering you? Or what you're afraid of? She knew this was a delicate question, and she would accept whatever answer they chose to give. Emily hesitated, glancing again at her sister before she spoke. Sometimes, Mommy gets really sad, and he makes her cry. Sophie's voice was barely a whisper as she added, He makes us scared too. Helen felt a rush of sadness and anger, both emotions intertwining as she watched the vulnerability in their young eyes. She reached out, resting a hand on each of theirs. I'm so sorry. My dears, no one should make you feel that way. For a long moment, they sat in silence, and Helen simply held their hands, letting them know they weren't alone. She wanted to say more, to offer them words of comfort or promises that everything would be all right. But she knew that promises alone wouldn't be enough. They needed more than words. They needed action. When breakfast was finished, the twins seemed reluctant to leave. They lingered, their small frames pressed against Helen in a way that broke her heart. But as the morning stretched on, they finally stood, exchanging a shy, grateful smile with Helen before making their way back home. The day passed in a haze of uncertainty for Helen. She found herself glancing out the window every few minutes, hoping for a sign of the girls or their mother. The quietness of the street seemed almost eerie now, a reminder of the secrets that lingered behind closed doors. She wondered if Lisa knew her daughters had spent the night at Helen's house, if she too felt trapped in the silence that had settled over their home. That evening, just as Helen was beginning to consider another check-in, there was a knock at her door. She opened it to find Lisa standing there, her face pale, her eyes wide with worry. Helen, I'm so sorry, Lisa whispered, her voice breaking. I didn't realize the girls had come here. I was worried sick. Helen reached out, resting a hand on Lisa's arm. It's all right, dear. They were safe with me. They just needed a place to feel secure. Tears welled in Lisa's eyes as she looked down. Shame and sorrow etched into her face. I didn't know what else to do. I feel like I'm losing control. I'm failing them. You're not failing them. Lisa, Helen said firmly, her voice filled with quiet conviction. You're doing the best you can. But sometimes, even the strongest people need help. Lisa met Helen's gaze, a glimmer of hope mingling with her pain. I don't know what to do anymore. I feel trapped. Helen's heart swelled with compassion and resolve. She knew this was her moment to reach out, to offer Lisa the lifeline she so desperately needed. Lisa, there are people who can help, people who will listen without judgment. You don't have to do this alone. Lisa's shoulders trembled, as though a weight had finally been lifted. I've been so afraid of what would happen if I tried to leave. I thought he might. Her voice trailed off, and Helen could hear the unspoken fears between her words. She nodded, squeezing Lisa's hand reassuringly. You're not alone anymore. Lisa, I'm here, and there are others who can help you. You deserve to be safe. And so do the girls. For a long moment, they stood in silence, the weight of Lisa's struggle hanging between them. Helen could see the quiet determination beginning to take root in her friend's eyes, a glimmer of strength that had been hidden beneath the fear. I don't know how to start, Lisa whispered finally. I don't even know where to begin. Let's take it one step at a time, Helen said gently. Tomorrow, we can make some calls together. Look at your options. There's no rush. Just know that I'm with you every step of the way. Lisa nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. Thank you, Helen. I don't know what I would have done without you. As Lisa turned to go, Helen felt a renewed sense of purpose. This small act of kindness, this simple promise, had the power to transform lives. She knew that helping Lisa and the twins would be challenging, that there would be difficult days ahead, but she also knew that she couldn't turn back now. This was her chance to make a difference, to bring a light into the darkness that had surrounded them. The next day, Helen and Lisa met over coffee at Helen's kitchen table, quietly mapping out a plan. Helen guided her through the phone calls, gently encouraging her as they reached out to support services and community programs. For the first time in a long while, Lisa began to see a way out, a path that would lead her and her daughters to safety and peace. As they sat together, planning and dreaming of a brighter future, Helen felt a quiet joy settle within her. She knew that, in helping Lisa find her strength, she was honoring her own life and the love she'd shared with George. This new chapter, born from kindness and compassion, was a testament to the enduring power of human connection. And as Helen walked Lisa and the girls to their car that afternoon, she felt a renewed sense of hope. A belief that from this small act of courage, a new life would blossom for them all. The street that had once seemed so lonely now held a promise, one she had helped nurture. And with each step, Helen felt her heart grow lighter, knowing that she had found her purpose once more. Thank you for joining us in this story of quiet courage, kindness, and the strength found in unexpected friendships. Helen's journey with Lisa and her daughters reminds us that even a small act of compassion can be life-changing. We hope this story inspires you to look around, reach out, and lend a hand to those who may be carrying hidden burdens. If this story touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share it with others. Every story shared is a chance to bring hope and light to someone's life.